Joining us on another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. Today's an interesting one and a topic I don't know too much about. Pretty interested in it and been learning bits and pieces here and there, but it's never been something I've focused on. And we got a pretty good guest to talk about this as Canada and its connections to the Spanish Civil War. We have Tyler Wentzell with us today, and he is one impressive person. So he's a lawyer, historian, and serving military officer. He's working on his PhD in law at University of Toronto, where he's studying the history of law and history of emergency powers and domestic military operations, which is interesting stuff because I'm helping with some research, and there's all kinds of crazy things going on there. He's a veteran Afghanistan and has an MA in war studies from RMC and is military faculty at the Canadian Forces College. And his first book is kind of how we ended up talking about this today. So he wrote a book called Not for King or Country, Edward Cecil-Smith, the Communist Party of Canada and the Spanish Civil War. There's links to buy it down below. Please do so. I've been reading it off and on for a little bit now, and it's an amazing book. It's an impressive bit of scholarly research, but just an interesting story about some interesting people. But Cecil-Smith himself is an interesting character, and it's definitely worth a read. So, hey, Tyler, how's it going?
Very good, Brett. Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming on, especially kind of a short notice there when I sort of just put out a message being like, I need some help. I need some guests. And you came to my rescue yet again, like you have in many other times in the past. So I appreciate that very much. So like I said, you're all over the place, but in a good way. I mean, all the things you're doing, all the things you have done, it's impressive. And this one is impressive too. This subject, as you and me have been chatting about, is not too well known, especially in Canada. I mean, Spanish Civil War, I'm sure people are aware. But not too much. Now, as I like to ask everyone, how did you come to this subject and Cecil-Smith? Maybe pick whichever, but if you can kind of explain how you got to this point, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's sort of, I've always found the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, the nominally Canadian unit that fought in the Spanish Civil War, to be just a really interesting interwar year phenomena that I saw relationships between some modern phenomena and that I found fascinating. So I always had that in the back of my head. But when I was at law school, I started to do a little bit of research on the law of foreign fighters and how, because the war against ISIS was going on. It was a particularly intense point in that conflict, and seemed like there was a story every week, every month about a Canadian who had made their way to fight for or against ISIS. So I wanted to do some research on that, and there were the relatively new provisions in the criminal code that dealt with traveling abroad to commit terrorist offenses. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, so I looked at the Foreign Enlistment Act, which was a law that was passed in Canada in the interwar years to deal with Canadians who were going abroad to fight in the Spanish Civil War.
Yep.
And in writing that and doing that research, I needed to find, it's helpful to find examples, right? A person who went to Spain prior to the law being enacted. So then someone who went to Spain immediately after the law being enacted. I started with Ed Cecil-Smith because he was the commander of the MacPabs. It seemed like an absolutely reasonable place to start.
Yes, it does.
And then the more I looked at him, the more interesting he became. Childhood as a missionary kid in China, coming to Canada. He was a banker, a militiaman, a married man. Nothing that I thought would immediately scream someone who would want to leave their job, leave their home, leave their wife, and go fight in Spain. And I kind of got obsessed, I guess. And a few years later, it popped a book.
Isn't that how it always goes, right? You get a topic, you're like, oh, this is cool. And then 4 years goes by and bam, something comes out of it. I mean, I know that story very, very well. It's something I did myself, right? In Hong Kong was definitely that for me, still is. I mean, trying to figure out what I wanted to do, kind of poking around, kind of found me and just sort of ran with it. So it's great to hear. And I guess that makes perfect logical sense, right? You pick the person who's, I guess, at the top of the Canadian, sorry, I can use the air quotes here. Sorry, it's reversed, Canadian battalion, right? And we'll get into why that's not true necessarily. And it's far more complicated
And
next.
along the way, I found his son. So
Right.
Bill Smith, Edward Cecil-Smith's son, we kind of by happenstance found one another, and
Oh, wow.
that also opened up a whole new line of inquiry, right? Like little stories that you know about your dad that
Mm,
out of context don't really make sense, but each little kernel led to opportunities to dig into some
right.
records and find, oh, this is what that's about. This is the story that your mom told you about this thing your dad did. This is
Mm,
a letter to your mom from Norman Bethune that she kept in her dresser drawer with
right.
his photograph with Mao. Like those little things also make it more fun and more compelling and kind of drive you onward in your research.
Yeah, I mean, those like I mean myself, I know that, and talking to people and hearing these stories, and sometimes you're skeptical, as you should be, doing these kinds, especially
Yes.
history. There's always kinds of stories out there, but sometimes it's like, okay, I'll do a dig, and then these things turn out to be true, or they're mostly
Or
true,
not. Yeah.
or not at all, which is always the most disappointing. And I'm sure there was a lot to do. Well, we had a comment from someone who always has to remain nameless in the chat, even though he's been on the show himself. Anyway, that you cleared up about Cecil-Smith. And I think, again, I'm a non-expert. I'm not going to pretend I know a whole lot about the Spanish Civil War. I know the interwar period, but only Canada, I mean, obviously. But I don't know that much. So I was wondering if you could kind of, because again, I know we were just talking about this, and I'm going through my head again because I was looking at your book, quickly going over those maps again, and I'm just like, whew, this is a complicated thing. So I was
It
wondering if you
is.
could just give us a real brief overview of how this whole situation started.
Well, the Spanish Civil War is, I think, one of the reasons I find it so interesting, and a lot of people do, is it's that metaphorical onion, right?
Right.
You can start at the outer layer, you can dig a few layers down, but you really can't ever get too many layers in, depending on exactly what moment you're looking at, exactly what region, because the Spanish people experienced that civil war in very different ways. If you lived in the Basque territory, if you lived in Catalonia, if you lived in
Right.
Madrid, regardless of your politics, regardless of any ideological, political, religious beliefs you may have held, you experienced that war very differently.
Right.
But then you layer on top of it the ideological conflict, the religious conflict, the nationalism that was built in there, and the part that foreigners, Westerners, tend to find the most interesting, the proxy warfare elements of it.
Right.
The degree to which Mexico and the Soviet Union intervened on behalf of the Republic, and the
Mm-hmm.
degree to which the fascist states, Portugal, Italy, and Germany, intervened on behalf of the nationalists.
Right.
And within all that, there's the truth versus perception piece that
Right.
that really plays out. This was in the middle of a culture war, of an international cultural war.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So that was also really interesting to me. There was some parallels in how two neighbors could access information in a completely different way and see the same event through an entirely different lens.
Right.
But in terms of the facts of it, in July 1936, the elected Spanish Republic suffered a blow when the nationalists led a coup, famously led by Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who lived until the 1970s. So a lot of people are familiar with his legacy, perhaps not as much with his early career. And this
Right.
coup broke out across Spain and in the Spanish colonies in Northern Africa and the island colonies. And when that happened, there were uneven, it was unevenly fought back against by the Republic. So in
Right.
places, they armed workers' militias. They just opened up the armories because it was the army that was rising up
Right.
against the state.
Right.
So there, in many places, notably in Madrid and Barcelona, they just started giving rifles to people, and those workers became the foot soldiers of the Republic. And there's a lot of kind of heroic moments that are really breathtaking and spoke to people on, thinking about like the barricades in Paris and whatnot. There was those kinds of
Right.
moments. But ultimately, it seemed like the Republic was just going to put down that coup for a brief period of time until German aircraft started ferrying Franco soldiers from Northern Africa into Spain. Because the Navy had stayed loyal. The Spanish Navy, for the most part, had stayed loyal. So in the midst of all this, there was the defense of the Spanish Republic by the Spanish people. There was broad support as well and conservative elements for the nationalists. It would quickly become a quasi-state, but it was just a rebellion in the early years. But the early intervention of Germany and Italy to assist the nationalists, then simultaneously there was this broad international appeal of defending the Spanish Republic. And in November of 1936, the first of the international brigades marched to the field in defense of the city of Madrid. And the truth is, the defense of Madrid was mostly fought by Spaniards. They bore the brunt of the combat, but the first of the international brigades, the 11th International Brigade, just became this symbol, this rallying cry to go to Spain and defend the Republic. If you fear the rise of fascism anywhere, you could go to Spain and pick up a rifle and fight that idea made incarnate. And the rest of the international brigades flowed from there.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of, because we were talking about this before we started, there's these popular perceptions of, still today, I could say, of the Spanish Civil War, what that means, from literary fiction and literary writers. We're talking about probably the two most known ones in the English-speaking world, right, is Ernest Hemingway, and from Whom the Bell Tolls, and George Orwell, Homage to Catalonia. Those are the two, I would think, biggest ones over everything else. I think they kind of cast this huge, a shadow over the understanding of these wars, and they're each done differently. I mean, Orwell's an interesting character in and of himself, his own interesting history and everything like that. Anyway, it's not about him, but I mean, just there's these misconceptions. There's a lot of them, and what it means, and also drawing these lines, like you said, there's lines all over the place, like ideologically, linguistically, which is even so interesting because of the country that it took place in, the countries that came in, and we'll get to that a little bit with Canada. But I mean, it's just, to me, it's utterly fascinating, and still, I don't know. And people who work in this area, yourself included, I mean, just ultimate respect, because this is so confusing to me. I mean, just like the different front lines, literally trying to understand the front lines, right? This isn't like World War I or II here. This isn't a slow marching line going one way or the other here. This is complicated, and there's different groups involved. Anyway, so kind of, you sent me something here that you put together a while ago when the book first came out, which was last year. Again, links in the description. Buy it because it's really, really good. About Canada and Canadians. Again, I'm gonna have to do the air quotes a lot today because that's probably the first one on. It is the first one on the list. Is about this first celebrity volunteer, and I wonder if you could talk about what that is and what that means.
So even though Canada has no obvious, tangible, direct connection to the Spanish Civil War, right? There was not a large Spanish diaspora, Spanish-speaking diaspora in Canada in the 1930s. It's not to say that there were none, but it wasn't a large community. It wasn't especially concentrated. So there isn't a huge direct connection. But a few things happened early on in the conflict that amplified the already existing ideological resonance. And one was that the first of the international brigades that I mentioned was ostensibly commanded by a Canadian, or that was his public persona. His name was Emil Kleber or Kleber, depending on who you ask. But this was the Austrian-born, naturalized Canadian volunteer who had made his way to Spain and now commanded the 1st Brigade that the 11th Brigade, the first of the international brigades in the defense of Madrid. And this was this big rallying cry of a moment. And that action corresponded with the return of 2 representatives of the Communist Party of Canada who went to Spain and bore witness to what was happening over there. They come back and they tell this story. Emil Kleber's in the news, and Norman Bethune is in the process of getting ready to go to Spain to lead the mobile blood transfusion service over there.
Right. Yeah.
So all of this happens in a period of about a month.
Okay.
Now, so this really amplifies that initial drive for people who might have been interested anyway. This really made it feel like they could be part of this thing. Now, the problem was that Kleber was in fact not Canadian. And there was this big inquiry within Foreign Affairs to figure out, who is this person? Is he actually Canadian? Is there some kind of responsibility we might have if he gets arrested, if he becomes a prisoner of war of the nationalists? And they quickly concluded that no, he is not Canadian. No one by this name has any connection. He was certainly never naturalized Canadian.
Right.
But it didn't matter, right? Like, in the popular consciousness, this was the guy. You could be this guy. Now we know that he was actually a Soviet intelligence officer. His real name was Moishe Stern. And he wasn't a military officer. He was a hard and fast intelligence officer who got thrown into the, okay, go command this brigade job. So still a very courageous thing to do, because it's not what he was trained to do. But he had done intelligence work in China and the United States.
Which kind of applies. I mean, obviously there are different situations. I mean, maybe China is the closest parallel, but even that's not the same, because China, again, was no peaceful place for a good chunk of this time. Anyway, so that's just, I mean, yeah, I think you just kind of there is these popular perceptions, what those mean. The facts are fast and loose. Do they even matter at a certain point, especially with this conflict? My gut says no, especially in what I know about the things that we're going to get to, because Bethune is one of them to me.
Yep.
I don't want to say any more, because I do want to talk about that a little more later. But to me, that's just, again, it's more complicated. It's so confusing. I'm just like, who's doing what and to what end, and who are they actually working for? Like, to me, the whole Soviet involvement, which makes perfect sense, if you stop and think about it, obviously, with the different, communist groups and all that involved on the Republican side, it makes sense. But again, the Soviet Union's looking out for itself all of the time. So there's that. But it's just, to me, you're just adding these layers. And like you said, you start peeling them back, and then you got to stop, because you're like, what is happening here? And this is just one of them. This, who's a Canadian, who's not? What does that even mean? I mean, I had that in another show that involved I'm doing it again, a non-Canadian conflict, talking about the Vietnam War and the Canadians who volunteered. And what does that even mean? So again, we're just kind of throwing, things into the wrench into the works a little bit with these kinds of books and thinking about these topics, especially from, say, if we're taking, like I do, because that's what I do, the Canadian perspective or the Canadian lens, and apply it to these things. And I think it's just so interesting to look at it. And like you said, it's such an interesting conflict. And we'll get to because what's the next one? Oh, right. About the international brigades, but we'll get there. So the next one is about recruiting the international brigades in Canada and how that was done. And I'm sure you're going to have to provide some background on what that means, if you could.
So I'll start with a caution, and that's, this whole conflict, because it's so complicated, it's a bit of a Rorschach. It's a bit of an ink blot test, where you can look at the same set of facts and say, and therefore the whole thing was just a Stalinist communist conspiracy. These were just puppets with no autonomy and no knowledge of what was actually happening. Or these were the purest of pure, ideologically motivated anti-fascists who ever walked the earth. And both versions are, might be true in an individual person, but across the 1,700 Canadians that went, Well, it's more complicated than that, because all of these things were happening. People were simultaneously motivated to fight fascism. Many of them had an allegiance to the Soviet Union.
Right.
And again, fact, Moishe Stern was a Russian intelligence officer, and also fact, the Communist Party of Canada ran the recruiting operation.
Right.
So they were, first of all, very well suited for this, because between 1931 and 1936, the Communist Party of Canada had been forced to operate underground.
Right.
They were an illegal operation, and they continued to function in spite of that. So how do you get good at that? Well, you develop safe houses, and you develop means of communicating, and you build those networks of confidence. This is a perfect system for, you just have to mildly repurpose it to get potential troops, potential volunteers to travel through safe houses, to get train and bus tickets, to cross the border, and to get to New York and onto a ship, where you'll link up with the French Communist Party and then the Spanish Communist Party, and then find your way to the International Brigade headquarters in Albacete.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that every single person in this chain believed in the purest of pure communist ideology. No, not true. We know that a lot of people just saw it as a means to an end.
Right.
I just want to get to Spain and shoot fascists.
Yeah.
And if these are the folks who are running the show, great, because
so be it.
So be it, because none of the other left-leaning organizations were any good at this. The Socialist Party of America tried to run a recruiting effort. That was a reasonably sized political party in the United States. Absolute failure. And almost every single one of the people that they did get to Europe, because they only took care of them as far as Paris, ended up in the International Brigades anyway, because there was no one to receive them on the other end, right?
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine if you were a Canadian and you wanted to fight in the First World War and you just found your way in London?
Yeah.
Like, what organization are you going to join?
Yeah, what do I do? Yeah, that's a great. Sorry, Tyler, there, just to cut you off quick.
Yeah,
that's
no,
a great parallel. I mean, it's perfect, because I'm sure I haven't really, I don't know if I've talked about this on the channel much, but I mean, in other areas I have, about how the recruitment worked, and especially with the First World War, it's a little different for Canadians. You can kind of pretty much join any empire service you want, but that's a good parallel here, right? That all of a sudden, yeah, you probably don't speak the language, and you get dropped off in these places, and you're told certain things, and that's not what happens. I mean, again, I don't want to keep going back to the fiction and everything, but you do get a sense of that, right? Especially from Orwell's book, you get I don't know. To me, it's just confusion. I mean, there's just so much going on, and who's what and who where. I mean, it's just, I think it's a great place to put it. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons the International Brigade works so well, is that it was organized on linguistic lines.
Right.
So it changed the 15th Brigade, to which the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion belonged. It changed its composition, but by October 1937, it had pretty much crystallized into 3 English-speaking battalions, 1 Canadian, 1 American, 1 British, and a Spanish battalion. So it was organized in a linguistic fashion. But the funny thing is that since recent immigrants were such a high proportion of the Canadian volunteers, if you were Polish Canadian, you might end up in the Polish unit, because that was your first language, and that worked best. It wasn't strictly based on nationality or citizenship. Then there were other examples. For instance, there was a lot of Finnish Canadians who went, and the Finnish Canadians coalesced into the machine gun company in the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion.
Right.
But because of the nature of the Finnish state at this point in time, there were not a lot of Finns who came from Finland.
Right.
But there were some. And where did they go? The Finns from Finland went and came and joined the Finnish Canadian Machine Gun Company. Had never been to Canada, had no connection.
Right.
But that's where the concentration of Finnish-speaking soldiers was. So,
Yeah, there's another wrench. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, like there's another one that I didn't know. That's crazy, and I just want to ask this because from Colin Taylor, who's a good supporter of my channel and everything I'm trying to do. This is a really good point because he's using the Irish example, talking about for those who joined the international brigades, you have the ones in support of Franco, because there was some international support of Franco in the same way we're talking about here with the international brigades. Was there Canadian volunteers for Franco? And before you answer that, I just want to, because I love to bring in context, because I have the PhD and I can't help myself, is that there had been Canadians who had volunteered for foreign service under the Pope, right? In the late 19th century, there was some Canadians who had gone to Rome to volunteer to fight in basically the Italian Wars of Unification. So there's there's precedence for this. So was there a sizable number, or are we just talking like 5 guys who did this kind of thing?
Well, I'll say a few words about the Irish situation, because it is another great example of how complex this thing is. So the from Ireland, I forget how big it was. We'll say it was a battalion, but a formed organization of blue-shirted fascists went to Spain to serve in Franco's army. That is something that left from Irish shores.
Right.
However, there was also a large number of Irish people who departed. They were not organized by the Communist Party, by the way. They had a different chain that fed into the Communist Party of Great Britain.
Right. Okay.
So, but by the time they got to Spain, they coalesced into what was referred to as the Connolly column. Now that term was really more applied after the fact, like how they described themselves, but it was used a little bit at the time, just not officially, because it wasn't like a battalion. It was just a group of Irish people within the international brigades.
Right.
And initially they were part of the British battalion.
Okay.
But then they voted, and because of the historic oppression of the Irish people by the British state, even though these were all, working class people who were theoretically there in solidarity, the Irish troops voted to leave the British battalion, and they got moved into the Lincoln Battalion.
Okay, which makes sense.
Which makes sense because there was also a large number of Irish Americans within the Lincoln Battalion. Yep. So that's where they landed. All right, so let's set that aside. So Ireland, also very complicated.
Okay.
And Papal Zouaves that you mentioned.
Yeah.
However, there was never too much of a movement for Canadians to serve with Franco's forces. Now, Michael Petro in his book has identified a handful of people that he's found, but it's a real small number. They're definitely the oddballs, the one-offs. But this is perhaps a decent time to say that although support for Franco, specifically in Quebec, never manifested as a volunteer movement, it did manifest as hostility towards the Spanish Republic.
Right, which would make sense.
So the Spanish Republic sent emissaries to do tours in Canada. Norman Bethune went on speaking tours. And in Montreal and Quebec City, these emissaries were often met with being kicked out of the stadium by the police. They had rocks thrown at them. There was rather hostile protests. And the desire for a Foreign Enlistment Act, a Canadian Foreign Enlistment Act in 1937, was the direct result of Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis' hostility towards all things even vaguely communist.
Yeah.
And this tension led to a miniature, not on the level of the conscription crisis, but it led to a miniature unity crisis, where there is broad support for the Republic in liberal, progressive, English-speaking Canada.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And significant disgust towards the Spanish Republic in French Canadian Catholic Quebec. I'm generalizing in very broad strokes, but generally speaking, that was the schism.
Yeah, I should probably say that right now with this, especially. But again, because we have some American viewers, British, Irish viewers, so and they're great people, smart people. I'm not saying they don't know this, but sometimes Canada's got its own weird things going on.
Yeah.
So sometimes we got to, brush some, broad strokes here, particularly. And I'm hoping I'm not offending anyone who might be watching now or in the future, because I am both English and French Canadian, so I think I can say these things. There are sometimes things that divide the country along those lines that are complicated, confusing, sometimes nonsensical. I'll just outright say it from both sides. I'm not saying both are not guilty here, because both have done it and done all kinds of things. Anyway, so just saying that we're not, generalizing in that sense. We're just saying sometimes you got to do broad strokes, like with Duplessis, as you mentioned. For those who don't know, he was the premier of Quebec, and interesting fellow. It's probably the quickest way to say it. For those of you who don't know, you can just do a quick Google of him after if you're interested in that, and you'll understand what we're saying when we're saying when Tyler said something about, he's against anything vaguely communist, and I laughed because he would just use that as a label to go against anything he didn't like, as many do. But he was really, really bad for that.
It's a good thing to broad brush.
So we'll just leave it at that. But these are, again, some of the Canadian things that come up that are fairly well known amongst Canadian historians. So again, if you're confused, which I still get confused, and I have a PhD in this stuff, fully admit it, just ask and we'll do what we can. Anyway, so sorry, that's a good point. I didn't want to backtrack again. There was another one here. Sorry. Because what was I asking about? Oh, right. The Canadians are joined for Franco. So you said a handful, not too many.
Yep.
So that makes sense. And you've mentioned it a few times. And again, this is going to need some background because not everyone's going to know what this means. You mentioned, the MacPaps. Can you explain what that means and how that name comes about?
This is another great example of truth, fiction, storytelling, legacy building, all overlapping. So the name Mackenzie Papineau Battalion refers to an actual battalion in the 15th Brigade of the Spanish Republican Army. This, what I say, ostensibly Canadian, nominally Canadian, because it wasn't, as we've highlighted, it wasn't hard and fast. All right, Canadians, get in that line.
Yeah.
This is the only battalion you can serve in.
Yeah.
And a part of that was the nature of how the organization grew, right? The Lincoln Battalion was formed in early 1937. It was one of the first battalions to see action in the Battle of the Jarama Valley outside of Madrid. So where did you put Canadians when they showed up? Well, you put them into the American Battalion. And many of them were put into the American Battalion. So quickly, the Lincoln Battalion, the nominally American battalion, becomes a mix of Canadians and Americans.
Right.
And then they form another American battalion. This is the George Washington Battalion. Well, again, what do you put in that? A mix of Canadians and Americans.
Yep.
Now, in the summer of 1937, this brigade gets terribly, terribly mauled. Terribly mauled, to the point that those two battalions get mashed together to form one battalion.
Yep.
At roughly the same time, you're building another North American battalion, but the Canadians are lobbying overseas saying, there's an awful lot of us, and it's a real shame that we don't have a Canadian name on a battalion. This becomes the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion. Yep. But what do you put in that? Do you take the troops who are out of the battalion that is serving on the front lines? Do you say, all right, if you're Canadian, get out of your trenches, go back, we're reorganizing you? No.
We got a name to keep here. Let's go.
We got a name to keep here, and we need truth in advertising. So get out and go back.
Yeah.
Not at all. So the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion from day one is a mix of Canadians and Americans. There was, in fact, only one Canadian officer, one Canadian company grade officer in the MacPaps when it was stood up. That was Niilo Makala. He was a Finnish Canadian lumberjack, editor, printer, all around fascinating character.
Yep.
Cecil-Smith joined later. Okay, so that's one thing. Like from day one, not truly Canadian, even beyond the fact that the Canadian state very clearly didn't acknowledge it. Now, where'd the name come from? The name is really important because the leader, Louis-Joseph Papineau of the Lower Canada Rebellion, and William Lyon Mackenzie of the Upper Canada Rebellion, who also happened to be related to the Prime Minister of the time. Don't think he didn't notice that. It comes up in his diary a few times.
Oh, yeah.
So Mackenzie Papineau, right? A great term of messaging working class solidarity. French Canadians and English Canadians combined into a single name that draws on the working class revolutionary heritage, although you couldn't call either of those two men working class by any stretch.
Not even close.
Not even close.
No.
So you've got this battalion that's never truly Canadian.
Yeah.
But you've got this name, and it's a great name, and the name catches on, but it gets confusing because the name is applied to the battalion, the formed battalion, but also any Canadian who served in Spain.
Yeah, which is so confusing.
It gets very confusing, and sometimes it is done to deliberately obfuscate what the battalion did.
Right, which would make sense.
So some stories have the MacPaps fighting in battles that preceded its existence by several months.
Right. That makes sense. This is another point brought up by Sheldrake here. Come on. Internet's fighting me again. It's also the centenary of the rebellion.
Yeah. So 1837, 1937.
Yeah, to 38. Anyway, yeah. So again, yeah, I think I just wanted to touch on the point about, because we've already brought up, the law forbidding volunteering for foreign armies, and Mackenzie King, who was prime minister at the time, a man who loved symbols. And when I say that, I don't think I can stress that enough. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, it's again the diary, and again, this is all publicly available. Anyone can go find it. I mean, you got a few minutes, go do it, because you'll find all kinds of weird things in there. Anyway, his kind of weird obsession with Hitler, which is just unfortunate. But anyway, so this man just basically wrote everything about his life, and he loved symbols. Like, he looked for symbols in like shaving. If the shaving cream fell a certain way, it would make him feel better or worse. Yeah. If you looked up while writing or reading and the clock was a certain way, he loved it or hated it. Like, I mean, it's just, he's all over the place. So it's a stroke of brilliance to name it after his great-grandfather. I think I can't remember. A couple generations prior at the time. So it's a brilliant stroke of PR. I mean, it doesn't really work.
No. And they wrote him a letter from Spain.
Yeah.
Like, Dear Prime Minister, we have named ourselves this.
Yeah.
And there's also the element of the public consumption of this name. So the without getting into the details, the Friends of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, the Popular Front organization that really contributed. So we're not just talking about First World War, Second World War, mailing chocolate and cigarettes to the troops, although that happened.
Yeah.
We're talking that was very important. We're talking about many of the Canadians only had proper boots to wear.
Yeah.
Only had a blanket in their pack, only had a warm sweater to wear because someone in Canada mailed it to them. The battalion ambulance, the MacPaps ambulance, was bought and paid for by money that came from Canada.
Yeah.
I think the ambulance itself physically came from the UK, but the money was raised.
Totally forgot about that story.
Yeah, the money was raised in Canada.
Yeah. So
this movement was huge. So that's the other thing when people wag their finger and say, "See, just Moscow puppets."
Yeah.
Well, this cut across many sectors of society.
Mm-hmm.
These were very, very, very popular events that were put on, and they had like these summer camp activities, and rallies, and they filled Massey Hall. 10,000 people came to visit them in Toronto when they arrived at the train station. It mattered to a lot of people, not just this one tiny segment of the Canadian population. It mattered to a lot of English Canadians in particular.
Well, that's one of the things that I wanted when I was kind of typing up descriptions like I have to do for YouTube and Twitter and all of that. It was Mackenzie, the rebellion leader, was Mackenzie King's maternal grandfather.
Maternal grandfather.
I was off by one. Anyway, that's why it's Mackenzie King, because his father was king. Anyway, what was I going to say? Yeah. So sorry, coming up with a description about why, or just saying that this isn't as well known, and the support that this war on the Republican side had. Again, we could go in down, I'm sure, many rabbit holes about what that means in terms of after the conflict and Cold War context and all of that, which I don't want to do because there's so much other things I want to get to. But I'm sure that plays a part in this, because you can't deny that. But again, this is another one of those things you don't hear too much about it. This was so well supported in Canada.
Yeah.
Not so much Quebec, but the rest of the country. And again, there's pockets always all around the country that are one way or different than the majority. That's how this always goes.
Yep.
But it was largely supported, and that kind of is forgotten. So that just leads me to another thing you put in that document about the numbers. Like, I don't typically like to focus on, numbers as comparisons, but this one's I think is important because you do a comparison with the United States.
Yeah.
But this one's really striking to me.
Yeah. So it's in a conflict like this where everyone's sort of getting there either illegally,
yeah,
or just not officially, right? Versus a grand overt exercise. It's not really fair to compare Canada to France, which has a border with Spain, or the UK where you can take a ferry. But it is fair to compare Canada and the US.
Yeah, I agree.
So from Canada, almost 1,700 Canadians went to Spain. Now, they didn't all fight in the International Brigades, but the vast majority of them fought in the International Brigades.
Yep.
And our population was about 10.95 million.
Mm-hmm.
10.95 million at the time. In the US, 2,800 Americans went. 1,700, 2,800. 1,700, 2,800. And the population of the United States was north of 128 million people at the time.
Yeah.
And you can debate like the census numbers and accuracy and whatnot, but still, we are talking about a gigantic participation rate among Canadians relative to our closest comparator.
Yep. Yeah, because Canada's just under 11 million, again, depending on reading of census data at that time, because that's the number that's cited for the Second World War, which is, as we know, coming. But like to me, that's well, this is kind of like the preseason, I guess, to the Second World War, as I've like to say to people sometimes, because it's kind of true. If to put it in terms that certain people understand with sports metaphors, but again, sorry, it's to me that's sticking out. Sorry, Sheldrake's always making me laugh with his side comments. That's good. They weren't all communists, though. Come on. Anyway. That's true, though. That's funny. But yeah, I think that's a striking one. The other one you sent me, we've kind of touched on about how the Canadians aren't all Canadian, right? They're born outside the country, which is kind of an older trend, I guess, if you look at it for the First World War. Not so much a trend for the Second. I think that's interesting how these things can kind of carry over. Again, we talked about that. There's been some chat in the sidebar about finding like Canadian graves, and they turn out they're born in Finland and all that kind of thing. So you're gonna see that through with the Canadian involvement again. I just love throwing wrenches into things, and that's a great one because again, I don't think that's talked about either, and then how these multifaceted people from many different places who probably didn't have a clear identity themselves or picked whatever they wanted kind of did these things. And to me, that's fascinating. Sorry, that's just me going on. But again, we don't want to spend too much time focusing on that because it's interesting. But okay. So there's one that really did stand out to me, and I was wondering if you could just talk about it again kind of briefly. As you put it that the Canadians didn't advance, and I mean in terms of up the hierarchy, not the war advance within the International Brigades. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
This was a beef among many of the Canadian volunteers that they articulated in their letters and in subsequent writings. And causation is not correlation, but the fact is that Canadians did not go very far in terms of rank. So Edward Cecil-Smith, who was the commander of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, he was a captain for most of his time there, and he was promoted to a mayor towards the very end of the war, towards the very end of his time in the war, I should say. And that's about it. There were no Canadian brigade chiefs of staff. There was no Canadian heads of anything. There were Canadians who served in the Brigade Scouts, for instance, or the Brigade Machine Gun Company, but generally they didn't go very far. And the Canadians never had, and we haven't spoken about the commissariat, the political
No.
officers within the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion and the rest of the International Brigades.
Yeah.
But those were also dominated in the Canadian battalion within the MacPaps by Americans. So even the political officers tended to be Americans.
Right.
Now, Cecil-Smith did some writing on this. Other people did some writing on this, where there was a sense that many officer appointments were to some extent a patronage appointment, and the patronage that was the favor that was being curried was the influence of the home Communist Party. And the Canadian Communist Party being not very influential relative to the American Party or the British Party or the French Party. So there was considerable frustration about this, and it manifested in other ways. So like the Canadians didn't have access to the transatlantic cable to send news back. So there's all, I can go at great length of the distortions in the storytelling that this caused, and how much of the information we had in Canada about what the MacPaps were doing, in fact, came from the United States or from letters home several months after the events they were describing. And who got the best billets when they went into a particular community, who got on the train when other people's had to camp out. The Canadians generally felt that they were getting the short end of the stick. And the explanation that they gave was because their home party wasn't as influential as the other parties.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense from everything I understand about how these things were organized. Again, complicated, but it makes perfect sense, and how that goes. And I think that's an interesting one, because again, I don't know. It's again, maybe I haven't broken that popular perception of how all this goes, but this whole Republican side is supposed to be about preserving the Spanish Republic, but taking on this socialistic, communistic, equalness, supposedly.
Yeah,
but that's not what happens, obviously. So it's an interesting one. Okay, so since we're getting closer to the hour, and I don't want to go too far over, is you mentioned him already, like you said in this little thing that you prepared for me. And I was thinking about it, not trying to, disprove you in a confrontational way, just being like, maybe not, just because that's what historians like to do. Is you mentioned Norman Bethune, who is probably the best known Canadian ever. Maybe not in Canada.
But yeah, exactly. Not in Canada at all, but
across the world. I think you're right. And that's an interesting reason why that is. So can you kind of explain what's going on here?
Yeah, so Norton, that's kind of a fun dinner party topic of conversation. Who do you think is the most well-known Canadian? Wayne Gretzky, whatever.
Justin Bieber.
Justin Bieber. Yeah, Shania Twain. No. Because Norman Bethune is known not to Canadians, but to almost everyone who has gone through the Chinese school system in the last 60 years. So Norman Bethune was a Canadian physician he was a thoracic surgeon, extremely successful, extremely proficient in what he did, and very much had active social conscience, was one of the leading lights in thinking about how poor housing influences tuberculosis rates. And your likelihood of recovering once you've gotten tuberculosis. There was the poor man's tuberculosis, and there was the rich man's tuberculosis, was how it was framed. The rich man's tuberculosis was less likely to kill you than the poor man's tuberculosis. So Bethune secretly joined the Communist Party of Canada after going to a physiological conference in Moscow, where he was very impressed by what he saw of Russian healthcare in the center of it all. There's lots to be said about the periphery, but he saw this public healthcare system emerging in the early Soviet Union that he
Mhm.
thought was just ideal, what
Mhm.
Canada needed.
Yep.
So he quietly joined the Communist Party of Canada. It was kept secret, didn't come out for a while. But when the Spanish Civil War broke out, he went to Spain and led a mobile blood transfusion team. And this was cutting edge for a number of reasons. Just the technology and the medicine of
Yep.
transporting blood and bringing it to frontline soldiers was just ahead of its time. And at the end of his time in Spain, he came back to Canada. He went on a speaking tour. There's a lot of reasons why he couldn't go back to Spain, some of which is probably not true. He was a bit of a womanizer, and there were allegations that he'd been womanizing some people who might have been spies and whatnot. Who knows what's true? But he wasn't popular enough to go back to Spain. So everyone was happy to have him tour the country and raise awareness about the Republican cause.
Yep.
And ultimately, what ended up happening, and I'll tell what's known, and then I'll tell the Cecil-Smith connection that happened in the background afterwards. He goes to China, and he becomes a thoracic surgeon for Mao's 8th Route Army, and he met Mao. And he ran public health initiatives and training and field hospitals. And ultimately, he died after he contracted sepsis after nicking himself. So it's good. If you want to be a hero, it's good to time your death so you're a martyr.
Oh, yeah.
And now he's immortalized in Mao's collected writings as the only foreigner that Mao celebrates specifically in his book. So he is extremely well known within the Chinese community, extremely well known. In Canada, it wasn't until Trudeau Sr. began normalizing relations with the People's Republic of China that the Gravenhurst family home was very quickly turned into a museum. But otherwise, completely unknown. So what's the Cecil-Smith connection? The Cecil-Smith connection, and I don't want to speculate on the nature of the relationship. It was intimate. I don't know if it was necessarily romantic. They were very close. Norman Bethune performed life-saving surgery on Lillian Googe, Edward Cecil-Smith's wife. And they became close friends. How close? Don't know. But when Norman Bethune came back to Canada after leaving Spain, they met. The family story is that Lillian told him, you should go to China. Lillian had a specific interest in China. She was the secretary of the Chinese Inland Mission, the missionary organization to which Cecil-Smith's parents belonged. And while he was in China, Bethune kept sending letters back to Lillian. And in these letters, he is imploring her to come join him in China. She has no medical training, doesn't speak Chinese, hasn't spent much time out of Toronto or London, Ontario. So she wasn't filling a capability gap. He wanted her companionship. On what level, one can speculate. It's very intimately written letters, though. But in that letter is the only photograph of Mao Zedong and Norman Bethune sitting together in that cave, in that moment that's been immortalized in writing in Norman Bethune's collected writings. And that photo is in my book, so, check it out.
Yeah, you gotta check it out. Yeah, I mean, that's it's crazy. I mean, I don't know. I can sum it up better than you kind of did. I mean, just these connections, the fact that Bethune is not as well. I mean, he's known sort of here, I would say. I mean, there's people who are aware of him. I mean, those in the medical community are aware of him, just because I know that because my mom is in the medical community, and they talk about him frequently because of his. Well, this is something I kind of wanted to ask you, because my mom works for Canadian Blood Services, which used to be the Canadian Red Cross, with the whole blood thing. He again, I don't know, because again, this whole war and all the characters, especially the Canadian ones, have all these myths and everything swirling about them. And again, I think I learned this from my mom, is that he did set up this, traveling blood transfusion, basically van truck thing. What I've heard is it didn't go well. He didn't really know what he was doing. He kind of bumbled his way through, and it just was kind of a failure. So that's why he left. Again, that's just conjecture and hearsay, but that's just what I've heard. Then that's the reason why. So I don't know if that's got any truth to it, or there's anything in your own work that you've come across about that. But that's
Well,
what I heard. He was a kind of a failure in Spain, and then China is where he kind of got into his groove.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that he was a failure in Spain. He just wasn't as successful as one might have hoped, because the blood transfusion service lasted longer than he did.
Okay.
So it continued in spite of his absence, whereas if it was just him muscling through the process, then it should have just vanished as soon as he left.
Okay.
What I'm not as clear on, and I think this is a great question for historians, is to what extent was what he developed influential on subsequent developments? Because what we know about what the blood transfusion service was, and
Yeah.
you know, the tubing and the vacuum sealing and all this,
Yeah.
it definitely saved lives. Did it save as many lives as it could have been if it had been a bit more optimized? And to what extent did we learn from, did anyone learn from what was being
Right.
done? I have no idea. We
Mm.
compare it to what usually you compare what Bethune's blood transfusion service did relative to how blood transfusions were done during the First World War.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And it is much more advanced than that,
Oh yeah, big time.
for sure. But what lessons were learned from what Norman Bethune and his crew were doing that was applied somewhere else and later? And to what extent was it just an aberration from that
Mhm.
evolution in medical science? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question for someone to look
Yeah,
at.
I just these are the things I hear. I've seen other things because there's been a bit of work done on, like you said, the blood transfusions and how that begins in the First World War, what that means, how that's done. I mean, it's not even close to how they do it today. Not
No.
even close. It's so much more advanced today. It's crazy. Anyway, so that was just kind of a quick aside, just because Bethune comes up as kind of, again, because there's talking the sidebar about who he is and what that means and all the stories about him. He's kind of a folk hero. Like, maybe that's a good way to put it in Canada. He's more like a
Yeah.
folk hero than like a national figure. Maybe people
Yeah.
know about him, and he's kind of elevated in a way. Like you said, he died at a good time.
He died at a good time, and you know, if you're in a certain community, you'll definitely know who he is, and
Yeah, oh, for
he'll
sure.
be elevated. If you live in Montreal, there's a statue of him there. If you live in Toronto, there's a statue of him here.
Yeah.
Um,
And he's from
also
Gravenhurst, which is on the
from
other side of
Gravenhurst.
Ontario. Yeah,
Yeah.
the house is still a museum that's very popular, particularly with Chinese tourists because
Yep.
of the education.
The plaque out front, the National Heritage Plaque, is in English, French, and Chinese.
Yep. So it's just an interesting one. Okay, so we're getting towards the end here, and there's a part here that is really interesting to me because it plays into events later about the passports, Canadian volunteer passports. And I wonder, again, I know it's not going to be simple, but if we can kind of use this as sort of the last kind of thing I wanted. Well, this is like the last part that you included, and I want to ask something about kind of legacy after, but just real quick, because there's a connection to Trotsky and a whole other thing going on here. It's just,
Yeah.
these stories are so fascinating.
So the passport thing it is pretty interesting. So if you were a volunteer and you made your way to Spain, when you got to Albacete, the International Brigade headquarters, you submitted your passport and your documents, and you know, you could look at that cynically and say, aha, they were harvesting documents for use for, you know, sketchy Cold War things.
Yeah.
Or you could say, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to fight a war with your passport in your pocket.
No, it doesn't.
So yeah, it makes sense for you to turn it in. Again, you can, it's that ink blot. You can look at it and see whatever you want. But I think it was just a practical, it made sense.
I mean, it makes sense if you think about it in that way, real quick. Because why else would you need it? If you're dead, you're dead. I mean,
Yeah,
and you have to go back through these centers to get home anyway. So anyway,
and that's just it. When they started this, they thought they would go back through those centers anyway. They did not anticipate
the ending,
the
yeah.
Aragon offensive towards the end in March 38, where they would lose this space, this territory. So in a hurry, when the base was evacuated, when the documents were evacuated, some of them made their way back to the Soviet Union. Now, the International Brigade's documents are held in Moscow. And along the way, some of these passports also went to Moscow and ended up in the possession of the various intelligence services. And there's two of these passports that are really notable. So one was the passport of a Canadian named Tony Babbage, whose passport was repurposed by Raymond Mercader, who was the assassin of Trotsky.
Mm-hmm.
So he had more than one passport for various traveling purposes. But this gentleman who ultimately assassinated Leon Trotsky in Mexico City, one of his passports was a repurposed Canadian passport. So that was one of them. And the other one was Ignacy Witzak, who was a Polish-Canadian volunteer. And the Russian operatives believed that Witzak had been killed during the war. Now, what they didn't realize was that Witzak had made it home, made it back to Canada, got some land, was working as a farmer, quietly doing his thing. Meanwhile, Ignacy Witzak, a Russian intelligence officer, was given the Witzak passport, and his wife, also an agent, was given a corresponding passport, and the two of them went to the United States, settled in California, and worked. The Ignacy Witzak was quite the academic, and he worked his way up through the university. And it wasn't until the Igor Gazenko defection, when this was identified, and the FBI moved in and started surveilling him directly. And there's some funny stories from the agents, because Witzak he's a trained operator. He would just walk up to them and be like, "Hi, why are you following me?" and then he disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
He slipped out of the country with his wife and family, and presumably, I haven't researched this any further, presumably got there and lived out his life there under his old identity. Yeah. But those are two Canadian passports that were used to do interesting things.
Yeah, and sorry, we have a quick question here from Sheldrick again, because I think it's pretty well known in Canadian history circles that there's no Canadian passports, official Canadian passports, until after the Second World War. Is this a British passport that's just happened to be?
Yeah, a British passport of a Canadian national. Yeah.
Right. So it's not a Canadian passport. It's a Canadian who is holding a British passport.
Yeah, a Canadian national who has a passport.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's what we'll go with. Canadian national with a passport. Because, there's no Canadian passport because there's no Canadian citizens until after the war, because they were technically British subjects. A whole legalese behind that. And you're a lawyer, and I am engaged to one, so I don't want to talk about law right now. Because we're getting over the hour, and this is one thing I do want to talk about, because it was at the beginning, and I like to leave legacy for the end, because I think that's pretty obvious why. Because where is it? It's a good question, or it's a good observation that I just wanted to get your quick thought on, if I can find the thing. It was a question from Sheldrake, or a comment about, because he does battlefield tour guiding, and about the Spanish Civil War. And he said he did, a recce for it and everything, but there hasn't been enough interest. Now, I was wondering if, I just want to find this, if I can find it. I was just wondering if you can, again, this is probably just your opinion, but, and I've talked about this, here it is, a little bit, of why maybe there's no interest, or why this is kind of pushed to the background, and you're researching in this and everything. If you kind of can be an angry opinion, it can not be fully formed, that's fine. But I just can't not think about these things, because obviously people are still interested in it and they're still thinking about it, but maybe not in the way we would expect.
Well, I'm interested. I hope to be going to Spain once the present difficulties in traveling leave us. Yeah. I think it has much, although there's lots of people who are very interested in the Spanish Civil War. Maybe there's, for instance, some very active Facebook groups. That is a community that has emerged.
Yeah. And you talk about that in the book briefly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I met wonderful people and got a lot of great information through these online communities. But in terms of that critical mass of people who are willing to, cut a check to go on a battlefield tour in Spain, I think it's just all other things being equal, it can't compete with with
Hmm.
the other battlefield tours that are a little bit more that have that state centric
Right.
hook,
I see what you
right?
mean. Yeah. Yep.
Like it is much, there's much more interest in my work related to like the Battle of Hong Kong or
Yeah.
Canadians in Italy. There's more
Yeah.
forums to talk about those things than on Canadians in the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
And I don't want to say that's a problem, but
Hmm.
the foreign volunteers that fought in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, that story isn't clean. It isn't tidy for the local community. It's not clean. It's not tidy for
Hmm.
Canadians.
Right.
So I think there's a barrier there. But I'd love to hear more about this battlefield tour you're planning.
Well, yeah, you can maybe. Well, I'm not sure if you guys know each other or not, but I'm sure you guys could talk about it. And I can help if you guys don't know each other. That's what I do. Put people together, and I love it. Anyway, yeah. Well, this is just again. He's always making me laugh. Anyway, Sheldrake, Dave Patterson saying they're a bunch of commies. I can hear people saying that.
I get that a lot. I get that a lot,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
accept it as a criticism, but as a historian, like, why does that matter? That makes it
Yeah.
more interesting. There's
I
more
know.
levels than
I know. It's just I think that's part of it, honestly, in my limited understanding, especially because even today, how communism, a lot of air quotes today, is viewed and what that even means. I mean, again, I feel like it's like 1956 half the time with people being like, everything I hate is a communism plot. I'm like, what year is this?
yeah.
Anyway, I just think that's a part of it, and that's still around, which is unfortunate because we're missing out on a bunch of things because of this. Like, I think Bethune isn't talked about in part because of the communism thing.
Yeah.
Like I can't remember. I was talking to somebody, and this was years and years and years ago. We were talking about the War Museum here in Ottawa, and there's nothing about him there.
Yeah.
No, nothing. And I went,
No.
that's a mistake. They're talking about how they want to bring in new people and younger people and people of different backgrounds and from different countries. I'm like, put up a Bethune part
Yeah.
and the interwar part. You know how many people will come see that?
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's a troubling problem for a lot of people who are descendants of
true.
volunteers. So I've done a lot of work with people whose mom, dad. There were a small number of women, but most women played a role in supporting on the home front, leadership
Right.
positions in those sporting movements, and a few did go to Spain in various capacities. So there were men and women who went. The fighters were obviously predominantly men, overwhelmingly men, but the children often do not accept at all that their parent was a member of the Communist Party, even if I have the record in my hand
Right.
that shows them to be a member. Like, well, then
Yeah,
that can't be right. Like, well, I think you just need to. Yeah, how you feel about your parent is one thing, but the 1930s was
different.
it was a foreign country.
Yeah.
It was a very different time, and you shouldn't be surprised that the person you remember and grew up with in the 50s and 60s during the Cold War had very different opinions about the world than they did in their youth in the 1930s.
Definitely in the 30s, especially in Canada. Because again, I think I have said this in the past because I know from my family experience, my own research and understanding of in-war Canada, which was part of my dissertation and other work, is how bad the Depression actually hit Canada. I think especially as we get further away from it, we're like, yeah, it's called the Great Depression. It's bad. And we get things like Grapes of Wrath, which is the United States, and all that clouds. I don't want to talk about that, but the Americans kind of cloud our judgment. Saying, oh, yeah, it's bad in the States, but couldn't have been so bad here because somehow we're always better, even though we're not.
Yeah.
To my American watchers. We are not better than you. I never think that. But I think because it was so bad. So people like, because my grandfather told me all kinds of crazy stories. Like his teacher one year in school wore the same dress every day because that's all she owned. Yeah. Because they were living in an area that was so poor. They literally had to leave the farm that they had been living on for generations because money ran out. And they just left it for the bank and said one day we're out and just left. So just why I'm saying that is because to understanding, say, socialism or communism as they would have understood it at the time or for their own personal reasons, it's not unsurprising because things were so bad.
Things were so bad economically, and we as Canadians sometimes like to pat ourselves on the back because we're so open and inclusive and progressive. Except, Montreal and Toronto were much more anti-Semitic than Toronto and Chicago at the same time. There were significant social issues as well that we just kind of hit 1945 and say that never happened.
We're good.
We love everyone now. There are no problems, which is absurd. It's just not what these people lived through.
Yeah. And I think that's another reason why I wanted to have you on. Not only did you kind of save my butt this week for having a show, but also because I know, because we've talked about all kinds of things over the years. Like we just realized we never actually talked like face to face over video or in person, which I think is funny because we've been talking for years. But anyway, we talked about all the different things and what all that can mean. So I love throwing wrenches in, as I'm sure people watching know. And this is another one. It's another thing that is complicated in its legacy. It's what happened then. It's understanding now. All of that great stuff. So anyway, it's been a great show. Thanks for coming on again and giving me this kind of rundown list, because I think it's great. And you should use this because you said you haven't used it, and you should because this is great. This is great for talking points. I mean, it's amazing. Just because there's so many things in there. You're like, I could build off this for like another 3 hours. But anyway, so because we're coming to the end, but there has been some recognition in Canada. I did want to say this, I forgot, because there are memorials to the MacPaps now. There's one in Ottawa, one in Toronto. I think that's it, right? There's only 2.
There's a great one in Victoria.
Right? There's another one out west. But yeah, so I've taken video of the ones in Ottawa here. It's near some other memorials, near the National Artillery Memorial, which is so funny. And then the Air Force one is right there too. It's just this weird collection of a bunch of them. Near the Canlone and Hong Kong one are all kind of mashed together. It's funny. But anyway, so there is some recognition of this because I see there's some talk about it, but also that then you talked about these points, but we've run out of time. The RCMP followed the vets. Some of them were interned during the war, or whatever word you want to use, imprisoned. I think intern is technically the right word, legally speaking. Anyway, so again, this goes on forever, and it's still going on today, and that's why your work is great. So again, thanks. I'm just going to do a quick sign off, and before we finish up, I'll just say bye, all right? I just want to do a few things with my audience here.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for coming out. I think this was a really, really interesting show, looking at a whole bunch of different stuff connected to Canada and the Spanish Civil War. Went down a few rabbit holes as these things happen with a very complicated topic. And a very interesting one that, again, I think doesn't get enough attention. And I think this is a step in the right direction. So with that said, if you enjoyed what you watched, please subscribe to the channel. Doing so is extremely helpful. Telling other people about the channel itself, as well as helping me grow it and continuing these things on, which I need your help to do. Can't do it all on my own. I am just one person. Also, if you like what you see and really want to keep this going, becoming a patron really helps. There's links below to do so. You got all kinds of benefits. I've added some new ones in the last couple of days. That'll help if you want to do some historical research. I have some other ideas I'm batting around to add more benefits for you if you become a patron, which would be very helpful for me to keep this going. So if you could do that, please do so. Or if you want to do a one-time contribution through Buy Me a Coffee, there's a link there too. And again, like I said, Tyler's book is really, really good. There's links down below from Bookshop, which I get a little bit of commission if you buy through there, which also helps me continue on the work. And also through Indigo, in Canada. But again, I'm just going to keep saying this. And Tyler's muted. You can't stop me from saying it's a good book. Please buy it. It's super interesting. I can see him laughing. So anyway, it is a good book. And again, the pictures and the maps and everything, it helps bring a little bit of clarity to this topic. If you are interested in it, I really, really suggest it. So thanks again, Tyler. There we go. For coming on again. I really appreciate it. Did you enjoy coming on? Wasn't too hard for you.
That was great. What historian doesn't like talking about the research?
Yeah, true. Yeah. If they don't, they got something wrong with them and they're in the wrong field. Anyway, so thanks again, everyone. There's another show coming up tomorrow where I do a review of a book about DIEP. So check that out. That's at 1 p.m. Eastern. So come check that out. It'll be a live stream, but as a book review, bring questions even about DIEP, and we'll see what we can do. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks for watching.